The chart for cultivation is very important tool for every grower. It contains all the information about the specific growing room and compost batch. When filling out the chart, it helps to remember all the technological processes. When the grower enters the growing room, they first look at the chart and already understand which stage, which day, and what exactly to focus on in this room. The chart records all the information about the compost, when it was filled, the number of growing rooms, the amount of compost in tons. The chart records all the information about the compost, when it was filled, the number of growing room, the amount of compost in tons, and the total number of kilograms per square meter. If there is leftover of the compost, it specifies how many kilograms are left, as well as the batch number of the compost, since each batch of the compost has its unique number. Next, the number of days of incubation, the compost structure, its moisture content, acidity, and any supplements, if any, are recorded, including the amount and type of supplements. The mycelium and the strain are noted. Then, information about the casing soil is recorded. When it was applied, its volume in cubic meters, the thickness of the casing soil layer, moisture content, and structure. If ruffling was performed, this is also recorded: the date, how many days passed before ruffling, and how much water was used before this stage. The quality of incubation is also recorded. The number of days from the application of the casing soil to start of cool down is noted. If grower have any comments, he can record them in the chart. This is very important, especially if you encountered a problem or, in contrary, achieved a good result. This will allow you as a grower to compare the situation with other growing rooms, understand what was done differently, and why you succeeded or conversely faced an issue. Let's start with incubation. Incubation is a process of mycelium growing into phase 2 compost that has already been inoculated, and our task is to ensure that the compost is completely covered with mycelium. It was previously believed that 14 days of incubation was the optimal period and was enough. However, I disagree with this. I tried to keep the phase 2 compost in incubation for a longer time, usually 18 to 20 days. And of course, taking into account the quality of mycelium growth. The longer period, 18-20 days, allows the mycelium to better penetrate inside the straw in the compost, so the mycelium growth happens not only on the surface but also inside. During incubation, the main parameter is the compost temperature. As we know, at each stage of cultivation there are different priorities, and for incubation this is compost temperature. On average, the incubation process lasts about 18 days. This is roughly where it ends. From the first day, I tried to keep the compost temperature within 24-25 degrees, for which, depending on the initial compost temperature, I heat or cool it. The air temperature is not as important because it is adjusted depending on the compost temperature and serves only to correct it. In the first days of incubation, the compost is usually inactive. If the compost is cold, below 20 degrees, on the first day, The air temperature can be set higher than the compost temperature to warm it up. Then, once the compost reaches the desired temperature, we lower the air temperature. Over the next 8-9 days, the compost remains inactive and its temperature stays a few degrees higher than the air temperature, which is around 21-22 degrees. Ideally, the difference between the compost and air temperature during this period should be 3-4 degrees of Celsius. During this time, I try to avoid using fresh air or use it minimally. To save energy, cold air from outside can be supplied if it's necessary to lower the temperature in the growing room. Or, on the other hand, warm air can be supplied to heat the room. However, I limit the supply of fresh air to 10% during this period. If the compost is in blocks and the blocks were not perforated during compost production, perforation or cuts on a film should be made in the blocks to allow the compost to breathe a bit. For ventilation, I usually keep the settings at medium power around 50%. I will note 50 here. At this stage, the air humidity is not crucial, but if the incubation is happening under paper or on shelves, the air humidity should be maintained at 97-98%. This prevents paper from drying out and consequently the compost as well. If the compost is covered with paper during incubation, it should be moisturized twice a day using the water spraying, approximately 0.3 liters per square meter. I will note 0.3 liters per square meter here. That means we spray the paper to keep it from drying out. If the compost is in blocks during this period, the floors and walls of the growing room should be moistened twice a day. At this point, it's not necessary to maintain high humidity in the room using the humidifier. 97% humidity is ideal, but it will fluctuate and it's sufficient to maintain its in range 96-98%. This fluctuation will not affect the quality of incubation. A very important period begins around the 8th, sometimes 9th day, depending on your compost. At this moment, you need to carefully monitor the compost temperature. This is when the compost temperature should start to rise. If you notice a tendency for it to increase, it means the compost is starting to heat up and become active. At this point, the cooling process should begin to prevent overheating. As we have already mentioned, during incubation, the priority parameter is the temperature of the compost. It can reach 28 degrees, which is considered the acceptable limit. Usually, such temperatures are maintained for 2-3 days, but this can vary, and the duration of this period depends on the quality of the compost. Our task is to cool the air in the growing room in such a way as to prevent overheating of the compost. I consider overheating to be temperatures above 28 degrees. Even prolonged periods with temperatures of 29 degrees and higher can be dangerous. If the temperature reaches 30-31 degrees for one day, it's not critical. However, if such temperatures last for 3-4 days or more, there is a risk of green mold trichoderma appearing. Trichoderma prefers overheated compost, and its development can lead to the death of mycelium. At higher temperature, undesirable fermentation process may begin, and an unpleasant smell may appear. To ensure the temperature does not exceed critical values 28-29 degrees, it's also important to understand where and what temperatures you have. They can vary in different parts of the growing room and differ depending on depths at which you measure the temperature. Every temperature values 26-27 degree are not critical, but it is important to consider that there may be risk zones in the room. For example, the upper shelf or end of the growing room may overheat more than the lower shelf or its beginning. During the critical period, it is necessary to take as many temperature measurements as possible in the growing room. The more data you gather, the easier it will be to prevent overheating. During this period, we cool the room as much as needed depending on the situation. It is critical for us not to allow overheating. We keep the air temperature low for the next few days until the temperature of the compost begins to drop on its own. When the compost heats up, it's due to the activity of the mycelium. This heating starts when the mycelium have already covered the inner surface of the compost, moving from one grain to another. It is no longer has space on the surface and it starts to penetrate into the straw, which leads to an increase in temperature and heating of the compost. Many people make mistake of starting to ruffling the compost, opening the blocks or supplying fresh air in an attempt to reduce the temperature. These actions, such as ruffling, opening the blocks or adding fresh air, as I have learned from practice, can actually increase the heating of the compost because oxygen activates processes that raise the temperature. After that, it is more difficult to stop the temperature to rise. During the peak incubation period, it's the best to use fans at maximum. When we see that the compost temperature is at its maximum, we set the fan to the maximum, up to 90-100% depending on whether the equipment can handle that load. It's important to avoid overheating the fan motors. If the motors do not overheat, we can set it to 100%. But to avoid this, I keep it at 90%. During this maximum heating period, to provide additional cooling, you can spray the compost with water or make light watering, which helps lower the temperature through evaporation. This helps to maintain or more easily reduce the temperature. Humidity, as I mentioned, is not as important during incubation, especially if the compost is in blocks. If the compost is covered with paper, it needs to be kept moist to prevent it from drying out. We need to ensure that the paper remains moist and does not dry out. When the temperature of the compost begins to decrease, you can gradually reduce the intensity of cooling. When compost temperatures start to decrease, this indicates that the compost has fully colonized and it's ready for further processes. However, I personally do not rush to open it because it seems calm. But especially during the hot period of the year, if we immediately open the blocks, start ruffling them, or begin working with the compost to prepare it for the application of the casing soil, as soon as we supply fresh air and oxygen, it can heat up again to crucial temperatures. Therefore, I leave it for few more days, not touching it until the mycelium are well established inside the straw. I emphasize that the mycelium should grow inside the straw, not just on the surface. I keep the compost at around 24 degrees and incubation lasts an average of 18 or sometimes 20 days. Why did I decide to maintain a temperature of 24 degrees for the compost and an incubation period of 18 or sometimes 20 days? I do this because of the 14th day. If there are any issues with the compost, they are not always visible. The early stages of diseases are very similar to the growth of the mycelium. An experienced grower can distinguish them by some signs. The mycelium of disease have a grayish tone and they are thin and elongated. In this case, this is not the mycelium of agaricus mushroom, but rather the early stage of disease from a competing mold. At this stage, the disease manifests as with vegetative growth, but after a few days, it may turn green, change color, or develop a smell. After this, the disease will continue to develop. Many compost producers recommend opening the blocks on the 14th day because after applying the casing soil, they can no longer guarantee the outcome. However, I prefer to open the compost on 18th day because at this stage, after the compost has undergone 18 days of incubation, it is much easier to determine whether it is a disease or mycelium of agaricus. At 14 days, these differences are harder to spot. If, when opening the blocks or removing the paper from the shelves, you notice poorly incubated areas or blocks with weak incubation, it is better to remove this compost from the growing room and place it closer to the doors. This will allow you easy removal and disposal in the case of disease development within a week, if any suspicions be confirmed. During this period, up until the 18th day, I also keep the fan at a high settings to ensure that any blocks or areas with delayed incubation do not overheat. These areas might remain unevenly heated and the problem might not be immediately visible. Therefore, I keep the fan running at a high speed. The humidity at this stage is maintained at 96-97%. If the blocks are closed and have few holes, a drier environment is acceptable. Inside the block, it will remain moist enough. If the compost is covered with paper, it should be sprayed 2-3 times a day. I use 0.3 liters of water per square meter for moisturizing the paper. This is the average amount I stick to. I usually open the compost on day 18. On the 18th day, when we open the compost, the fan speed should be reduced to prevent the compost from drying out while opening or ruffling it. This is to make sure the compost doesn't dry out while we are opening the blocks and ruffling them. If it's possible, the floors should be moistened and the humidity in the growing room should be increased to prevent moisture loss from the compost while the work is in progress. This stage marks the beginning of opening the blocks or ruffling the compost. Here we have blocks opened and we ruffle the compost. As I mentioned, each stage has its own priority parameters. They differ at each stage. During incubation, our priority is temperature of the compost. I am currently highlighting it. In the future, what will be highlighted in red is what has priority at this stage. The air temperature is not a priority right now. It will change to ensure the priority temperature of the compost.